ghost ship. In a small village on the ocean coast, life went on as usual. In the evenings, local fishermen gathered in the old Shell Reef bar, where, sitting on warm wooden benches, they talked about the events of the day, shared stories and legends. However, what they loved most was when old Frank, the oldest and most experienced fisherman in the area, started talking. With his hair as white as sea foam and wrinkles as if cut into the ocean winds, he was the living embodiment of the sea. In the evenings, when the fire in the bar was fading slightly, his quiet but deep voice immersed everyone in old stories. That evening, Frank told a story he had known since childhood. His father told it to him, and his grandfather told it to him. The legend of the ghost ship, which terrified everyone who saw it in the open ocean, revived in his words, filling the soul of listeners with chilling fear. Frank began slowly, as if plunging into the memories of distant years. Once upon a time, in the era of pirates and naval battles, there was one ship that terrified the entire fleet. It was the Petrel, the greatest pirate ship, operating in the ocean with such speed and power that no one could resist its attacks. It was impossible to compete with him. It was equipped with many guns, and the crew, consisting of the most skilled pirates, was completely subordinate to their captain. But the most intimidating was the captain himself, Jonathan Blake. It was said that he was not only strong, but also possessed a devilish mind. Under his command, the Petrel became a legend, leaving wreckage and horror in the hearts of sailors. Blake and his team remained invincible for years, until one day the English Navy sent an entire battleship against them, created with one goal: to destroy the pirate and his ship. And one dark night, this fight finally happened. Frank paused, and it seemed that everyone around him was holding their breath, waiting for him to continue. He slowly looked at his listeners, and one by one they felt an icy chill creeping up their backs. The battle began with cannons, he continued. A deafening roar broke the silence of the night, and flames engulfed both ships. They fired and fired until both ships began to collapse under the weight of cannonballs. But neither the pirates nor the British retreated, and when the cartridges ran out, the boarding began. The whole night ocean was filled with screams, and death was everywhere. It seemed that no one would survive in this hell. Frank fell silent, and the listeners in the bar felt their hearts racing. They knew that the story was just beginning, but they had already felt the full fury of that battle, as if they themselves had seen two mighty forces collide in a deadly battle. Old Frank leaned forward a little, continuing in a low voice. The pirates were on the verge of defeat. The Petrel was literally falling apart, and it seemed that this was its last fight. But Jonathan Blake was not going to give up. He knew that luck had turned against him this time, and then, in desperation, he called out to the devil. That night, he swore to serve the devil forever, just to gain strength and win, and the devil heard his plea. Frank paused, and everyone in the room was silent, as if spellbound. The sky turned black, and a storm broke out over the ocean. A funnel opened in the water, sucking in all the light around. The Petrel was pulled into it, and for a moment there was nothing left in its place, only black waves and thunderclaps. But after a few moments, the ship surfaced again. It was no longer the same Petrel. He was a devilish brat, terrifying even from a distance. The listeners froze, feeling cold sweat trickle down their backs. It was as if they saw a transformed ship in front of them, its masts stretching into the sky, and its new appearance as if covered with unknown sinister symbols and patterns. Frank took another sip of rum and continued, Captain Blake himself and his team have also changed. They were no longer humans. They were demons created to kill. Their eyes were blazing with fire, and their strength exceeded anything the other pirates had seen. They destroyed the English ship and sent it to the bottom, as well as everyone who dared to stand in their way. But the payback for this power came almost immediately. The devil took their souls and bound them to the ship forever. Now this ship is doomed to sail the ocean forever, hidden in fog and night. Frank looked back at his listeners, and they held their breath and stared at him, as if they themselves had become part of his terrible story. Frank muffled his voice, squinting, as if he himself was peering into the fog of those long-ago years. My grandfather, William, was an experienced sailor. That night, they were returning home after weeks of fishing. The sky was starry, the moonlight reflected off the calm water, but suddenly a thick fog covered everything around. No one paid any attention to it. The mists always came suddenly. But this one was different. It was dead, cold and thick, as if the night itself had decided to block their path. William and his team felt the air around them become heavy, and the silence engulfed them, as if absorbing every sound. The ocean froze, as if frozen in time, and suddenly the crew saw the silhouette of a huge ship that slowly emerged through the fog. Its outlines were unclear, but the masts stretched high into the sky, and on the bow of the ship there was a strange symbol, a black raven, which seemed to be watching each of them. All the listeners caught their breath, and Frank continued. At first, they thought it was an ordinary ship, but as they approached, they noticed that the petrel was dead. Its masts were twisted like withered hands, and the wooden hull exuded a rotting smell. The remains of torn ropes lay on the deck, from which black drops oozed, as if the ship itself was bleeding. When they looked at the deck, they saw figures standing motionless, dark, shrouded in shadows. They looked at them without blinking, with empty eyes, as if they were dead. But they were alive. The listeners in the bar sat motionless. Each of them felt a chill run through their skin. Some exchanged worried glances, but no one dared to interrupt Frank. My grandfather told me that these figures were lifeless, but their gaze, their empty eyes bored into everyone, penetrating into the very soul. William tried to tell the team not to look, but his comrades were already mesmerized by this eerie sight. Suddenly, the ghost ship abruptly approached, and although there was no wind or waves, it was moving directly towards them with frightening speed. Frank paused again, as if gathering his thoughts, and then continued, making his voice quieter, as if even the very memory of that night was frightening. When the petrel drew level with their ship, its crew, if they could be called a team, moved towards them. These figures, like shadows, moved aboard William's ship, but moved as if they did not exist in the ordinary world. Neither the deck nor the surrounding air touched them, and every step of these demonic creatures left traces of charred wood. Then William realized that these were not just ghosts. They were servants of the devil, forever chained in cursed shells. The listeners in the bar felt their hearts beating wildly, but no one could interrupt the story. They were all captured by the creepy images that the old man was painting. When these creatures got closer, they began to whisper. It wasn't an ordinary whisper. It was deep. It sounded like it was coming from underwater, pulling them into its abyss. The first to go crazy was a young sailor named Peter. He jumped up from his seat and rushed to the side, shouting words that did not seem to belong to our world. It was as if something was commanding him to jump into the icy water. The others tried to stop him, But Peter broke free with incredible force and disappeared overboard. His scream was swallowed up by the fog. The old man continued, looking up at each of his listeners. The team found traces of these creatures all over the ship. Footsteps, charred marks, like claws dug into the deck, and the darkness seeped everywhere as if alive. They could not find their comrades, and at some point they heard a soft moan coming from the hold. When they went down there, they found two sailors lying on the floor with distorted faces. Their bodies were cold, and their faces were distorted with grimaces of horror, as if they had seen something so terrible that even after death their souls could not find peace. The audience held their breath, and Frank continued, his voice barely audible. A few people, including my grandfather, still managed to survive, but it was those who did not look directly into the eyes of these demons. They rushed into the boats, leaving the damned ship behind, and, without looking back, rowed until the petrel disappeared into the fog. He left as suddenly as he appeared. The survivors were exhausted, scared, and many of them lost their minds forever. But William was lucky to escape this fate. Frank sighed, looking around at his friends. Each of them sat in eerie silence, and their faces were distorted with fear and horror, as if they had experienced it themselves. Old Frank fell silent, plunged into silence, and it was as if the whole bar had plunged with him into the darkness of his story. The fire in the lamps barely illuminated the room, and even it seemed dim, as if the flame itself was being consumed by an invisible darkness. None of the young fishermen dared to break the silence. Everyone felt how this story was imprinted in his soul. For a minute or two, everyone sat in silence, not daring to make the slightest movement. One of the young fishermen, Dan, nervously ran his hand across the table, wiping his palm wet with sweat. It seemed to him that he could still hear the whispers the old man was talking about, and he felt uneasy. Jack, another young angler, swallowed several times, feeling his heart continue to beat with painful force. In the darkness of the bar, every rustle and movement began to seem ominous, and in the corner outside the window, he could have sworn that he saw a shadow flicker through the night. He knew that it could only be a trick of the light, but the fear that had arisen inside him said something else. Frank looked up, scanning the crowd with his tired but tenacious eyes. He seemed to see how his story left an indelible imprint on everyone, awakening in them a fear that they did not even know about. He smiled, but there was only an echo of understanding and sadness in his smile. He knew that they would never forget this story, just as he had never forgotten it himself. Someone whispered softly, "Do you think this ship is still roaming the seas?" But there was no response. Only the heavy silence plunged the bar into silence, leaving them alone with the memories of the ghost ship, which seemed to be already too close to just remain a legend.